our guest speaker, Dr. Jennifer Glancy. Dr. Glancy completed her doctoral studies in New Testament at Columbia University, and since 1990, she has taught at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York, where she is the Reverend Kevin G. O'Connell Distinguished Teaching Professor of Humanities. Dr. Glancy is here today under the auspices of the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation. But a number of groups helped make her trip possible, and I'd like to thank the University Lectures Committee, the School of Theology, the Humanities Program, and the Religious Studies Department for their financial support. I'd also like to thank Hannah Pommersheim, research associate with the Roberson Project, for all the work that she did to help bring Dr. Glancy here, and for coming up with the idea of a lecture on the Bible and slavery in the first place. Dr. Glancy is a respected expert on the cultural history of early Christianity and the New Testament. A 2018 Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, her research interests include corporeality and Christian anthropology, women's history and antiquity, gender theory, and comparative studies of slavery. In two important monographs, Slavery in Early Christianity and Corporeal Knowledge and Early Christian Bodies, both published by Oxford University Press, she challenges popular assumptions about the seeming incompatibility of slavery with early Christian beliefs, as well as the complacency of scholars more interested in the life of the soul than the place of the body in early Christian communities. I highly recommend both books, but for the general reader, perhaps the best thing that happened to her research is her shorter work, Slavery as a Moral Problem in the Early Church and Today, which aims, among other things, to highlight some of the ways in which early Christian writings that touch on slavery may offer resources for confronting ethical dilemmas of our own day. Dr. Glancy's current book project itself pairs investigation of early Christian understandings of slavery and 21st century debates about what makes us human. The combination of historical reconstruction and ethical reflection that characterizes Dr. Glancy's scholarly writing is also something her work shares with the work of the Roberson Project. As I hope everyone here is aware, the first of the project's four main objectives is to conduct comprehensive research into the history of slavery, race, and racial injustice in connection with the University of the South. In this evening's lecture, speaking about slavery, Jesus in Today's World, Dr. Glancy will expand our sense of the history of slavery by turning our attention from the antebellum American South to the early Christian communities of the Roman Empire. At the same time, she will invite us to reflect critically on what early Christian texts that speak about slavery might still be saying, for better or worse, in the present, as canonical scripture and culturally privileged literature. And after this evening's lecture, on Monday, February 17th, from 4:30 to 6 p.m. in the EQB House, to be exact, we invite you to continue this reflection and to discuss the topic of slavery and the Bible. For now, I turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Glancy.
Good evening, and like Professor Thurman, I really want to thank everybody for coming out on a rainy night. I want to thank Professor Thurman. I think I first met you when you were a graduate student, so that's got to be like at least 5 years ago, right?
Yeah, exactly.
5 years ago. So it's really wonderful to see you again. Hannah Pommersheim, who I met yesterday. I'd like to thank all the members of the Sewanee community who have given me really kind hospitality, those who have funded tonight's event, the lecture committee, the seminary, religious studies, humanities, but especially the Roberson Project on Slavery, Race, and Reconciliation. I'm just gonna, I've a bunch of images in my PowerPoint presentation, and I'll tell you what most of them are, even though in some sense they're just functioning as a backdrop. This is from the year 13. It's an apprenticeship contract in unusually good condition. The apprenticeship is to teach an enslaved girl whose name was Helena, to teach her the craft of weaving. It's from Egypt, where most of our documentary evidence from the Roman world is from Egypt. When I say documentary evidence, I mean things like contracts or wills. It's most of it's from Egypt because Egypt had the climactic conditions to preserve organic materials. So what we're going to be doing, what I'll be doing this evening, is speaking about Jesus, speaking about slavery. As a New Testament scholar, of course, I'm going to situate Jesus' discourse about slavery in a first century context. But I also want us to step back and to consider how we might better respond to early Christian writings relevant to Jesus and slavery, even as we come to terms with how those teachings and that legacy have informed our institutional and socio-political contexts. I think I'll be speaking about what Jesus says and does not say about slavery, also speaking about what it means for us to raise that question. We is problematic. I speak as a U.S. citizen, as a baptized Christian, but I'm sensitive to the fact that others in the audience may not share those identities. I speak as an academic, as a Northerner, and as a white woman. So yes, I will focus on Jesus and slavery. That's my academic expertise. But I will do so in a way that does not let any of us off the hook, even as I recognize that us is complicated. So this talk is part of the Roberson Project, which of course invites your campus community into an ongoing conversation about Sewanee's entanglements with slavery and slavery's legacies. And it's a conversation specific to this campus, but it's also part of what's going on much more broadly on a national level, a national conversation and a national challenge extending far beyond this mountain, this state, this region. So for example, the image here is from the institution where I earned my PhD, Columbia University. And here we have alma mater herself, positioned right in front of Low Library, very dramatically. As some of you may know, Columbia University was founded during the colonial period as King's College. And during that period, New York was an important slaveholding city. I think 20% in the 18th century, I think something like 20% of the population was Black, and much of that population was enslaved. So alma mater is juxtaposed with a plan for an 18th century slaving ship that was owned by the Livingston family, one of many New York families made wealthy by the slave trade, who built the endowment of King's College. So this information, Columbia has a project. It's not on the scale of the Roberson. It's not as central to the life of Columbia as I hope the Roberson project is here. But it's Eric Foner's project at Columbia on coming to terms with Columbia's legacy of slaving. So I think this is a conversation happening lots and lots of places. Incidentally, with respect to Columbia, there is also an Episcopalian Anglican connection, as the foundation of King's College was a project of Trinity Church, Wall Street. On a personal level, although my family of origins, post-Civil War immigrants to the United States, I've been the beneficiary of lots of kinds of white privilege. And I've also benefited from associations with institutions whose endowments were fattened by slaving, including, of course, Columbia. It's a different story with my family of choice. I married into a family with a history, a New England family with a history both of abolitionism and of slaveholding. And I've written about this family history. The citation to the article is there. We actually stopped. So the homestead, the family homestead in Western Massachusetts, is now a public museum, the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum. And, you know, like everyone does on their honeymoon, we stopped at the family museum. It's a little strange to me. My family doesn't have museums, or my family of origin doesn't. So we stopped and we identified ourselves to the docent, who was really kind of thrilled to be showing us around. But she would forget herself. And so she would show, you know, like these horrible conditions where the enslaved members of the household slept. I think it was in the kitchen. They were like, oh, this is the slave slept here. And then she'd remember who we were, and she'd step back and say, oh, don't worry, they were treated like family. Well, you know, I'm a historian of slavery, so I know that the way people enter families is they're born, they're married, the way they leave families is they die. And if you look at the household records from the Porter Phelps Huntington family, my husband's family home, my family home by extension, enslaved members of the household came in through birth, but they were also bought and sold into the household. So there goes that family narrative. People are not treated like family if you're buying and selling them. So this image is of a letter written by an enslaved man who was owned by my husband's family, or I should really say by my family. His name was Caesar Phelps. He was a black man who served in the place of his white owner in the Continental Army. It was customary for slaveholders to share their military wagers with the enslaved men who risked their lives in their stead. And Caesar Phelps in this letter is complaining that he didn't get his wages. And he also says that if the family sells him, they should send him his stock and buckle, his personal goods. So he insists on what he understands is rightfully his. So one of my major motivations for research into early Christian slavery is trying to get a sense of what went wrong from the outset, how the practice of an ideology of slaving infected Christian theology and institutions, and how we can think and pray and act otherwise. In this particular case, we can see the use of an enslaved person as a surrogate body for the slaveholder. Later, I'll suggest that we might want to question the implications of choosing the figure of the slave as a surrogate for the human relationship to Christ, where Christ is implicitly understood as Kyrios, which I would translate not as Lord, but as Master. So what I'm going to do in this talk is speak about Jesus, speaking about slavery. I'll locate Jesus in a slaveholding world, and that's going to slide right in without any clear transition to what we'll call dualology, analyzing the place of slavery in Jesus' discourse. And then we'll think together about how to contend with this legacy in the 21st century, although it's really this third question, how to contend with this legacy in the 21st century, that drives all the questions I ask in the presentation. With respect to that third point, I'm cribbing from the mission of the Roberson Project. The goal this evening is to help us confront our painful history in order to seek a more just and equitable future. So the image here is the Roman road in Sepphoris in Galilee, which is about 3 miles from Nazareth. I have been unable to find a date for the road, although most of the archaeological findings in Sepphoris date at the earliest to the 2nd century CE. Certainly by the early 1st century, by the time Jesus would have been growing up in nearby Nazareth, Sepphoris was already a prosperous regional center. I'll return to Sepphoris and to the question of slavery in 1st century Galilee. We'll step back a little bit on an inner overview of slavery in the early Roman Empire. And because our discussion is framed by the urgency of concerns of American Christians, it seems appropriate that we approach the discussion of slavery in the Roman Empire from a comparative perspective, asking how was 1st century slavery similar to or different from the forms of slavery that developed on U.S. soil, keeping in mind that many different forms of slavery transpired on what later became U.S. style, that there were major differences between the slaving experience in Florida, the Iberian heritage, in Mississippi, in the Chesapeake Valley, in colonial New England. Similarly, in the Roman world, there were a variety of different, it was very different, I think, probably to be enslaved in a small craft shop where you might have the slaveholder might own 1 or 2 slaves as opposed to the imperial household. So there are vast differences between experiences of enslavement in both of those contexts, but we can still talk about structurally about some similarities. So one of those parallels between Roman slavery and Atlantic world slavery is commodification. The image is a 1st century contract, again from Egypt, good preservation conditions. It's a contract for the sale of a slave, a 32-year-old woman named Thyssarion, whom the vendor had inherited from his mother's side of the family. As is typical, there's a physical description. She has a long face with a scar. She has honey-colored skin, and a guarantee against all defects except running away. So important parallel between ancient and modern slavery is that enslaved persons were considered commodities, bought, sold, listed alongside other household goods, included as property in wills. I'm actually really interested in terms of this commodification of slaves, in terms of the question of what it would have been, the experience of being sold. I highly recommend a book about the sale of the slave in the Americas. Does anyone know this book by Dana Barry? The Price for Their Pound of, it's called the Price for Their Pound of Flesh, the Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave, and the Building of a Nation. And what she does, first of all, is to look at the prices that were paid for enslaved people from the time they were really in utero or in the reproductive capability of a woman up until what was paid for their body parts after death. But she also asked the question of what was the experience, how did enslaved people remember that moment? To hear your dollar value listed, or to hear your value listed compared to that of a donkey or grain. And evidence is that people remember, even if they were very young, that was a moment that they remembered. And I've actually been looking at some of that material for a project I'm doing called Selling Joseph, where I'm looking at sort of the memory of Joseph being sold and sort of what that commodification of the biblical Joseph does to that figure. But that's a conversation for another night. Another parallel between Roman slavery and Atlantic world slavery is what the sociologist Orlando Patterson has called natal alienation. The image is interesting. It's a tombstone from central Italy. I don't know the date. It's an enslaved 1-year-old whose name is Ursio. It's unclear who set it up, a slaveholder, a birth mother. It's striking because this image is so rare. I don't know if it's unique, but it's extremely, extremely rare. So Patterson identified natal alienation as a defining element of slavery. Enslaved persons had no legally recognized kin, neither ancestors nor descendants. In the words of a 3rd century Roman jurist, we speak of parents and sons and brothers of slaves, but slave relationships have nothing to do with law. Of course, enslaved people did have informal family bonds, both in antiquity and the Americas, but those relationships had no legal standing, and they were tenuous. They could be disrupted by sale, and they frequently were. Another striking similarity between slavery in the Roman world and the Americas was violence. The image some of you may recognize is the Arch of Titus in Rome, the spoils of the Jerusalem temple being paraded through Rome. In his essays in the edited volume, What is a Slave Society?, classicist Noel Glancy argues that both Roman slavery and American slavery were characterized by levels of violence extreme even among slaveholding societies. He compares that for example, to certain Asian systems, including those of Siam and Korea. I have to say I'm ignorant of those slaving systems. Both Roman and American slaving systems were tolerant of stomach-wrenching violence on a daily basis, but in certain moments, both systems sustained even more excessive practices of violence. In Rome, that violence was economically irrational and included lethal violence against enslaved bodies on a spectacular sale associated with celebrations of military victories and gladiatorial combat, other bloody spectacles, and then that violence spills back into the everyday treatment of slaves. To the spectacular orgiastic violence of Rome, Glancy opposes the equally devastating but economically motivated violence of plantation life. This particular image counterposes the triumphal parade on the Arch of Titus to Eli's witness patent application for the cotton gin. Historian Edward Baptist has detailed the impact of the cotton gin on slaving practices. As it became easier to process cotton faster and faster and faster, it needed to be harvested faster and faster and faster. And so over the course of the 19th century, enslaved people were required to pick more cotton. And that was exacted out of enslaved bodies through violence. And so I think a lot about how do you represent violence? How do you represent slavery? And it's pretty customary to do that with images, for example, of a scarred back. I'm trying to think of ways to think about, well, what's the engine of violence here? The engine of violence is an economic engine. And so that's what I'm trying to illustrate with that slide. I don't know ultimately whether we can measure comparative violence. I think Noel Glancy is brilliant, but I'm kind of dubious about the comparative level of specificity in this comparison. I think if you're talking about violence in the American experience of slavery, you certainly have to talk about the Middle Passage. But in any case, there's incredible violence both in Roman slavery and in slavery in the Atlantic world. There are differences as well. There are other structural parallels. One final structural parallel between slavery, Roman slavery, and American slavery is that in both systems, slaveholders had sexual access to the bodies of the enslaved. It's not really that relevant to what I'm talking about tonight, but ask me about it in the questions and I won't stop talking. But there were differences between ancient and modern slavery as well. Two of those major differences include rates of manumission and the social integration of the formerly enslaved, with Roman slavery characterized by a higher rate of manumission, which is freeing slaves from slavery, and a much more positive integration of the formerly enslaved into wider society. I don't want to exaggerate. I see sort of kind of a sloppy scholarship all the time where people go from many slaves were freed to most slaves were freed. That latter is not true. In the Roman world, our best evidence suggests that most who were born into slavery died in slavery. But manumission was more common in the Roman Empire than in the United States. And although freed persons had continuing obligations to slaveholders, and there was a stigma attached to being freed as opposed to freeborn, it was also possible for the formerly enslaved and their offspring to participate in wider socio-political and economic systems. So a third difference between Roman and Atlantic world slavery is, and going back here, that's just the other image there. That's a really interesting recent book by Rose McLean about the integration of freed people into Roman society. So I recommend that. The final difference I'll talk about between Roman and Atlantic world slavery was the emergence of racialized slavery in modernity. There are notions of race and ethnicity in antiquity. They are both different from and similar to notions of race and ethnicity in the modern world. I don't think we have had any major studies of race and ethnicity and slavery in antiquity. I think that project needs to be done. Slavery is typically ethnically based. Those who are enslaved tend to be seen as other. But there's not the same, in the Roman world, slaves were imported from England, Northern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Greece. And so there's not the same racial definition of slavery as very quickly comes to be the case in the Atlantic world. So the emergence of racialized slavery and the production of the modern category of race goes hand in hand with the poor integration of formerly enslaved persons into free society. This is a distinctive of Atlantic world slavery, and I don't think we can overstate its impact into the present. But let's go back to Galilee and Judea. Let's go back to Sepphoris. I realize all this discussion of Roman slavery can seem quite remote from the roads Jesus actually walked. The first century historian Josephus reports that after the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE, a Galilean named Judas led an armed insurrection against royal strongholds around Sepphoris, as I mentioned earlier, just a couple miles from Nazareth. In their brutal suppression of the rebels, Josephus says, the Romans crucified 2,000 men and then sold the entire population of Sepphoris into slavery. I'm something of a historical minimalist, and by that I mean, I'm reading Josephus. I'm always a little dubious about the details of what he's saying. Sometimes I think he exaggerates. But I think it's plausible that some version of this story is true. I think it's likely that means that Jesus grew up hearing that large numbers of residents of a nearby town had been sold into slavery to distant parts of the empire. In Galilee, as in other parts of the Roman Empire, slavery was both a mundane and an ominous reality. So this Josephus is also the source for the often repeated story about the mass suicide murder at the fortress of Masada several decades after the execution of Jesus at the end of the Jewish War, when Jewish rebels killed their wives and children and then themselves to avoid enslavement. There are a lot of reasons to be dubious about the specifics of the story, but it clearly reflects the sense that for many freeborn persons, death was preferable to the dishonor of slavery. And then in first century Palestine, from the Galilee to Judea, inhabitants would have been aware of and wary of slaving practices throughout the empire. One other fascinating note on slavery in first century Palestine, keeping in mind that my idea of what's fascinating may not be your idea. Both Josephus and Philo, so first century historian Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, the great Jewish philosopher of the first century, report that Jewish sectarians, they called the Essenes, rejected the practice of slaveholding. Philo furthermore explained that the Essenes viewed slaveholding as a violation of common humanity. We're not sure whether this is actually the case, whether the Essenes actually avoided slaveholding. What is pictured is a piece of the Damascus document found at Qumran with the other Dead Sea Scrolls. The Damascus document suggests that the Qumran community, whom most scholars associate with the Essenes, that they did own slaves, but that the individuals in the community did not. But when I think about the claim by Josephus and Philo that the Essenes did not own slaves, I'm struck by several points. One, it was indeed possible to imagine a community without slaveholding. But the followers of Jesus did not go that route. But also that living without slaves was considered so exceptional that it required some comment. So where would Jesus have interacted with slaves? Just as my historical minimalism requires me to take Josephus with a grain of salt, I'm inclined to be a minimalist regarding what we can know about the historical Jesus in terms of any given words or deeds. The evangelists were not newspaper reporters. And I guess I'd say this, I think we can know Jesus had a reputation as a healer. I think we can know there were probably incidents that contributed to that reputation. Can we know that any particular healing took place as it's described? I'm agnostic on that. I mean, that's what I mean by saying a historical minimalist. I nonetheless think the evangelists had a much better sense than we do about daily life in Galilee and Judea. So the image here to illustrate daily life in first century Palestine is a boat from Capernaum, from the Sea of Galilee. I'm not suggesting that slavery is part of the fishing trade in Capernaum, but for me it's a worthwhile thought experiment to consider whether it might have been, and what the implications would be for thinking about the social location and Jesus' close circle of male followers. Although the evangelists are removed from early first century Palestine by decades and miles or decades and leagues, they are much closer than we are. So what do the Gospels tell us about contexts in which Jesus and his circles interacted with slaveholders and slaves? So I'm going to look at a couple of gospel texts where we see Jesus interacting with someone who's explicitly mentioned as either a slaveholder or a slave. This image, by the way, is from 4th century Sicily. It's not really historically accurate of anything, but I do think it makes an immediate visual point about violence and the embodiment of hierarchy. So this is the story about Jesus and the centurion, or in what I take to be a variant, Jesus and a royal official. In all versions of the story, the location is Galilee, so either in or near Capernaum, and that actually matters because it means that the centurion would have been a Herodian centurion, not a Roman centurion. Probably doesn't make a difference for the story I'm telling. First basic point, as we try to imagine where Jesus and those close to him would have interacted with slaveholders and slaves, we should recall the large slaveholding households of the occupying military and the Herodian family. So in the story, a centurion or a royal official sends to Jesus to ask him to heal a household member who is variously reported as a son, a slave, or a pais, and pais can be translated child, slave, or even young male lover. In Luke, the centurion paternalistically asks Jesus to heal a slave who is described as either honored or expensive, depending on how tendentious you want to be in translation. The centurion says something like this: "For I also am a man set under authority with soldiers under me. I tell my soldier to do something and he does it. And I say to my slave, do this, and he does it." So does this vignette record a historical episode? I'm agnostic, but the point is to help us imagine contexts in which Jesus would have been likely to interact with slaveholders or slaves, and also in this case to understand how the hierarchical relations of slavery informed everyday life. Another context in which we see Jesus or those in his close circle interacting with slaves and slaveholders is the night of Jesus' arrest. Truth in advertising, this is very definitely not the house of the high priest in Jerusalem. To begin with, it is not in Jerusalem. It's one from the terrace houses in Ephesus, but I picked this image because I was trying to give it a sense of the richly decorated interiors of wealthy homes, and just trying to imagine, I'm always picturing the disciples walking on dusty roads. But if they were, going to the high priest's house, they were going to a fancier house than you might be imagining them. The stories told about the night of Jesus' arrest featured Jesus and his followers interacting with a number of characters identified as slaves, with John featuring the greatest cluster. All 4 canonical accounts mention that a follower of Jesus cuts off the ear of a slave of the high priest. who accompanies the arresting party. In John, the person who cuts off the ear is named as Peter, and in John, the slave is named as Malchus. In John, when Peter and an unnamed disciple go to the home of the high priest, they interact with an enslaved woman, Paidiske, the doorkeeper, who asks, "Weren't you with Jesus in the garden?" Warming their hands in the courtyard are other enslaved members of the arresting party, along with other attendants and lower-level officials. And then inside, in what I take as an accusation, another enslaved man, a relative of the slave whose ear has been cut off, asks Peter again, "Weren't you with him?" And I have to think that's an accusation. "Didn't I see you cutting off the ear?" So is this a historical record of the night's events? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the point is simply for us to notice, to become aware of the context in which Jesus' followers encounter and interact with those as enslaved, their ability to move into the house because of contact with the high priest, but also their mingling with enslaved and other low-status members of the high priest's establishment. Once we are able to locate Jesus in a slaveholding world, I think we can easily imagine other reported encounters that are likely to have involved slaveholders. So these aren't people whom the text names as slaveholders. But when I read the Gospels and I read that Jesus cures, heals the daughter or raises from the dead, the daughter of the synagogue, the head of the synagogue, I'm thinking, head of the synagogue might be a slaveholder. When Jesus has a conversation with Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus is wealthy, I'm thinking Zacchaeus might be a slaveholder. When Jesus has a conversation with a rich young man, alternately identified as a royal official, I'm thinking might be a slaveholder. Would Jesus also have interacted with enslaved members of those households? Were any of those who followed Jesus enslaved, or formerly enslaved, or descended from slaves? So I think we can learn a little bit more about the shape of slaveholding in smaller households from a parable that Luke attributes to Jesus. Speaking to the apostles, Jesus says, "Which one of you who has a slave that plows or tends sheep, when he returns home from the field, would say to him, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron, and serve me while I eat and drink? Later you may eat and drink.' Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded?" So I'm among those scholars who date Luke to the 2nd century. I don't know how close he is to the rhythms of everyday life in Galilee, although I kind of suspect he's closer to the rhythms of everyday life in Galilee than I am, standing here in the 21st century. And this strikes me as a plausible account of the kinds of demands that would have been placed on an enslaved person in a small household called upon to labor both in field and the kitchen. There is something really, really disturbing about the way that the parable is included in Luke. Because in Luke, Jesus says this specifically, explicitly to the apostles. "Which one of you who has a slave that plows or tends sheep?" And if you read it in context, it's implying that one of the apostles might have been a slaveholder, a small-scale slaveholder. Does Luke think that, is this just an accident? Luke's a pretty good writer. He doesn't have that many accidents. Does he think that the apostles were or could have been slaveholders? This is rarely addressed in commentaries. I find it really disturbing. When it does come up in commentaries, people tend to shunt it aside. Well, like, this is obviously a mistake, or he can't mean it. And that may be the case, but I just want to call your attention to the fact that's what Luke says. So as we continue to think about Luke 7, verses 7 to 10, we quickly move beyond the task of locating Jesus in the midst of a slaveholding world to consideration of slavery in his discourse. What Jesus says, what Jesus does not say about slavery as an institution, but also the way that he relies on the logic of slaving. So in this particular short parable, after remarking that the slave would be required to prepare and serve the meal before sitting down after a long day in the fields, Jesus continues, "Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you are ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.'" So here's tonight's big word, duology. And it occurred to me, I had done this whole talk, and then I realized, it's possible that not all of you know that the Greek word for slave is doulos. It's really something that is so constant in my own writing that I'm like, I guess I need to explain that. So doulos is a Greek word for slave. And I take the term duology from the South African scholar Chris de Wet, who, along with being a really terrific scholar, is a great corner of neologisms. He rarely has met a Greek root that he could not turn into a new English word. I believe he debuted the term in his first monograph, The Magisterial Preaching Bondage, John Chrysostom and the Discourse of Slavery in Early Christianity. For purposes of our discussion this evening, I would point us to the more recent and less intimidating volume, The Unbound God, Slavery and the Formation of Early Christian Thought. The volume traces the extent to which dualology infiltrates and deforms basic Christian teachings on Christology, the Holy Spirit, and sin. DeWett's work primarily concerns post-canonical sources from about the year 200 on, but the concept of dualology seems a helpful rubric for thinking about the reliance on slavery in Jesus' discourse, perhaps especially the parables. And I'm going to skip part of this. So DeWett writes, how and why did the early Christians think or communicate with slavery, and to what end? How did they use slavery and mastery to make sense of their own position in the world and society, and to better understand their relationship with God, the self, and others? It's this latter question that seems especially relevant to me for thinking about the place of slavery in Jesus' discourse. How did those who transmitted the sayings of Jesus use slavery and mastery to make sense of their own position in the world, and to better understand their relationship with God, the self, and others? So, how did they use slavery and mastery to make sense of their relationship with God, the self, and others? And you have Jesus saying, we are worthless slaves. We have only done what we ought to have done. The concept of dualology helps me articulate what is at stake in the analysis of slavery in the parables of Jesus. Dualology helps illuminate how the parables attributed to Jesus reinscribe and condone received patterns of mastery and submission. Dualology also helps illuminate how slaveholding ideology comes to shape Christian self-understanding in a way I found problematic. I could multiply examples, but I'll only focus on one more parable, the parable of the abusive slave overseer in Luke. And this is another not quite right image. It's the overseer, the parable we're about to look at is distributing food, and he's doing it in a very wicked way. But this is a woman selling food in the market. It's a 2nd century relief from Ostia, the ancient port of Rome. I'm going to read this parable in a minute. Every reference in this translation, that's mostly an adaptation of New Revised Standard Version. Every reference to a master in this text translates some form of the noun Kyrios. And I think most of you are probably used to hearing in scripture when it refers to Jesus, that translated Lord, but to me it's really weird if there's a passage on slavery and mastery to translate it Lord in some places and master in the other. So these days I try to consistently translate Kyrios as master, including when it refers to Jesus. I don't think ancient audiences would have understood the distinction that we want to maintain between Lord and master. So the parable, Peter said, Master, are you telling this parable for us or for everyone? And the master said, who then is the faithful and prudent manager whom his master will put in charge of his slaves to give them their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. Truly, I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that slave says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and he begins to beat the enslaved males and the enslaved females, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come in a day when he does not know it, and in an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. That slave who knew what his master wanted but did not prepare himself or do what was wanted will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. So we could pick up some interesting tidbits about domestic structure and relationships among enslaved members of a larger household, but I want to focus on dualology, the place of slavery in Jesus' discourse. Again, I raised DeWett's question. How did early Christians use slavery and mastery to make sense of their own position in the world and society, and to better understand the relationship with God, the self, and others? As the enslaved overseer makes a bad wager that the master's return will be delayed, there is no daylight between the master represented in the parable and the master whom Luke's audience expects to return. The parable relies on the inevitability of the brutality in the life of the slave to figure eschatological punishment. And in this, I think, does two things. 1, implicitly condones the routine use of violence to maintain domestic order, and 2, casts a hierarchical and punitive worldview as distinctively Christian. The parable not only figures the believer's relationship to Christ as the bondage of slave to master, but also structures relationships among Christ followers on the hierarchical model of a large slaveholding household. About 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, I gave my husband the draft of an article that, on slaves and slavery and the parables in Matthew. It appeared in the year 2000 in the Journal of Biblical Literature and was the basis of a later chapter in Slavery and Early Christianity, my first monograph. And when David gave it back to me, it was covered in red because we edited each other's work. So if you think his editorial comments, but when he handed it back, he just said to me, "I want you to have a different conclusion." And I do too. But when I return to the parables, even after several decades, I'm still struck by their thoroughgoing integration into the larger discourses of slaveholding in the Roman world, normalizing the domination and violence constitutive of slaving. I'm also struck by their equally thorough infiltration of Christian imagination, shaping the ways that Christians came to understand themselves in relationship to God, to one another, and to institutions. This slide is deliberately blank to give ourselves some room to think. We're still focused on dualology, the place of slavery in Jesus' sayings, but we are also moving in the direction of considering the implications of speaking about Jesus, speaking about slavery. I'm going to reflect on another saying attributed to Jesus, a saying repeated in multiple forms by the first generation of Christian writers. Although I will give my own complicated view, I would love to hear in the question and answer your own reflections on whether the saying might disrupt the pattern of dualology I perceive in the parables. So I'll focus on the version attributed to Jesus in Mark chapter 10. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. At least from the time of Paul, some followers of Christ called themselves slaves of Christ. Although we can hear this term in various ways, there's at least an echo of a wider cultural practice of styling oneself slave of a particular deity. So I don't take it as particularly countercultural. But the saying in Mark is different, calling Christ followers to be slaves to one another. I take the foot washing scene in John to be a kind of performance of this mandate. And in Galatians, Paul encourages those who follow Christ to be slaves to one another. Perhaps we can usefully highlight what is distinctive about the saying in Mark by contrasting it with the practices associated with the Roman festival of Saturnalia. At Saturnalia, slaves and masters changed places for one day out of the year. The masters served their slaves in a carnivalesque atmosphere that temporarily reversed but ultimately sustained hierarchical relationships. This saying is different. It imagines a community in which everyone strives to be the slave of everyone. It therefore imagines a community without masters. And hence, from one perspective, this particular saying of Jesus, which resonates so powerfully in early Christianity, empties the slaveholding ethos of its power. I want to think both about the potency and the limits of the saying, and that includes stepping back to consider what else Jesus might have said about slavery, but there's no indication in the historical record that he did. Actually, I might skip that page. No, I'm not going to. So how the tradition remembers what Jesus did and did not say. There's nothing in the tradition to suggest that Jesus ever instructed enslaved people to obey their masters. So that, unlike the instructions we find in Colossians, Ephesians, Titus, 1 Timothy, there is no suggestion that he encouraged enslaved persons to interpret their beatings as a kind of merit, as 1 Peter does. But on the other hand, there's no suggestion that Jesus ever suggested to a wealthy person that they should manumit their slaves. In the synoptic tradition, he tells the rich young man, sell all you have and give it to the poor. But he doesn't say, free your slaves and divide your household with them. Instead, we have this very different instruction: become slaves to one another. On a personal level, I find this challenging in a good way. And yet at the same time, I find the implications of this teaching to be ambivalent, inadequate, and at times harmful. So I'd like to raise 3 points for your consideration. I find so returning to this concept of dualology, I find the saying limited because it stays within the ambit of dualology, with followers of Christ using slavery to make sense of their position in the world and society and their relationships with one another. It's a different form of dualology, but I find myself using on the poet Audre Lorde's famous saying that we cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So let me phrase this as a question. Can we dismantle the house of the curious using the language of dualology? That's a real question. I'd be curious to hear your responses. A second limitation is that the saying resonates very differently for those in positions of wealth and power and those who are not in positions of wealth and power. To serve as a slave may be a transformative experience for someone accustomed to being served, but it's a very different experience for someone who has always and only known that role, who has internalized that role since youth, or has at least been told that they should internalize it. Historically, of course, it's more often been women and other low-status persons who have been told that their never-ending service is obligatory, and higher-status persons who have been applauded for occasional public performances of humble service. On the one hand, it could be a powerful experience for a lower-status person to take their place in a community without masters. On the other hand, I always wonder in practical terms whether and how it benefits those of lower status when those of higher rank walk away from their privilege. And the image I have chosen is a fresco of Macrina the Younger, a 4th century Christian, sister of Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea. And Gregory of Nyssa wrote the greatest anti-slavery piece in all of antiquity, bar none, I believe. So it was a great family. A model of humility, Macrina is celebrated because she chose to pursue her Christian vocation by living in the same manner as the enslaved women in her household, a kind of proto-convent, a community with no master, a community with no mistress. And yet I have the same question I do when I hear the story of the rich young man. What if Macrina had instead freed her slaves and shared her estate with them? I do think there's an experience for powerful or wealthy persons who are transformed by self-emptying, but do we prioritize that over what it is for persons of lower status to continue to hear these words? I also think there are many persons of lower status who may and do find validation in this fundamental teaching, but let's not assume that they all do or that they all should. So, final point. About Jesus, this instruction of Jesus. Although I still hear the countercultural pull of a community without masters. After the middle passage, I cannot conceive it as an adequate response to the massive harm that was done, harm that continues to be perpetuated into the present. The harm of slavery is an ancient harm. In the decades and centuries after Jesus proclaimed the good news of a community without masters, the church failed to live into that mandate, absorbing instead the ideology of a slaveholding empire, supporting the disciplinary role of masters, telling the enslaved that fear of their heavenly master should motivate obedience to their earthly masters. The harm that was done is also modern. Indeed, the harm that was done enslaving is the very condition of wealth creation in modernity. Until we find words to speak about the unspeakable wrongs of modern slavery and our collective complicity with that history, until we reckon the debts that are owed, it seems inadequate to focus on the self-emptying gesture of a community without masters, a gesture that focuses on the behavior of the privileged rather than the needs of those excluded. So this closing image is an extract from that letter written by Caesar Phelps, the enslaved man who fought in the Continental Army as a surrogate body for his owner, my husband's ancestor, my ancestor. In that letter, Caesar Phelps demands the wages he is due for risking his liberty. Caesar Phelps demands the wages he is due for risking his person for a liberty he did not enjoy. As I think about our churches and our society beginning to repair the harm done by the age-old massive human rights abuse of slavery, priority needs to be given not to the desires of those who benefited from the system for forgiveness or redemption, nor even to the hope of those who enjoy mastery to live in a community without masters. Priority needs to be given to listening to the claims of communities that have suffered centuries of harm for payment of what is owed. I'm curious to know what you think. That's it. Thank you.
For some questions, and I'll open up to
Yes.
Well, if Jesus were the Son of God, then it would make sense that he would have a negative comment about slavery. But if he were strictly a revolutionary who wanted to reform the Jewish church, taking on slavery would be a little more than he could.
Okay, so I'm not sure about the first part of that, about Jesus. Okay, I see what you're saying. I guess what I would say is this. The early church, from early on, Paul is suggesting that people who have certain kinds of behavior should be excluded from the church, certain sexual behaviors. That seemed to be more important to him than excluding slaveholders. So you could say taking on bad sexual behavior is also begging off a little more than you can do. But there's a prioritization here. He could not have ended slavery in the Roman Empire. From the beginning, he could have said, slaveholders can't follow me. He could have said, you know, free your slaves if you want to follow me. The early church could have said you can't be baptized if you're a slaveholder. So I agree that you couldn't, you know, totally take on slavery in the Roman Empire and end it. But as opposed to the Essenes, following Josephus saying about the Essenes, well, you know, they don't, and whether or not that's true, but following Josephus both have this clear idea in the first century that there's this group of Jews who does not permit slaveholding. And Philo says it's because of our common humanity. It doesn't seem to have occurred to Jesus' followers to make that same move. And the Essenes were also trying to reform Judaism. Does that respond to the question? Okay, thanks. That's a great question.
Well, I have another one.
Sure.
So you don't say anything about Paul or Paul's comments. Is that just too much to take on in one lecture? Or?
Oh, I'm happy to spend another hour or two. I am so not kidding you. Yeah, but no, I just decided for tonight to focus on Jesus. But if you have a specific comment about Paul, I have no idea you want to hear. Really.
Well, he has some more specific comments about slavery, or so it appears.
Okay. So it depends. I'm the kind of New Testament scholar who would devise the letters that are attributed to Paul from the letters that Paul actually, so Romans, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians are by Paul. The specific letters that say slaves obey your masters, as though they are the Lord, etc., as though they are the master, or Colossians, you know, 1 Timothy. So those are what I would call Deuteropines. Paul certainly says a bunch of different things about slavery in different places. In Galatians, certainly he says, for those who are in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's not male nor female. I don't know that he plays that out in the logic of the rest of that letter. I mean, he goes immediately from that to relying on the discourse of really duality of slavery and mastery in some problematic ways. In 1 Corinthians, he says the perfectly obscure, if you are enslaved and you have the chance for freedom, malon cresi. Which either means if you have the chance for freedom, grab it, or it means if you have the chance for freedom, don't grab it. You know, so there's quite a lot that we could say about Paul. And if you have a specific question, I respond to it. But it was just, you know, but no, this was just really. I said I'd try to bring it in around 45 minutes, and I think I run it at 45 minutes. Yes.
Do you know how the church or the Episcopal Church specifically addresses some of these?
Actually, I don't know. I do know in specific places it was coming up. I'm not sure what happened, but I believe in November at the Diocesan Convention in New York. I know there was something to sort of. They were trying to. There was like a 19th century chants. Do you know about this, Hannah? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, the Diocese of New York passed a bill against slavery that had been on the books and then contributed some money to fund for recreation, which is one of them.
Right, this is one of them. So I think it varies from diocese to diocese. I mean, I think there are local efforts in different dioceses, different places to take it on in different places. I think that's part of the conversation that's happening here, for example, in the School of Theology. But I think it's very important. And then, it's the Episcopal Church. I teach at Illinois College, which is, I had to make a decision because I only had 45 minutes. So I talked about my alma mater, Columbia, but for a while I had a bunch of slides about Georgetown. I went to Jesuit College, and of course Georgetown right now has been in the news quite a lot because Georgetown is a precarious moment in its position. The Jesuits, still wanted slaves so that they could continue that institution. So how do you reckon with that history? So a lot of that's going on here on this campus. It's going on regionally. It's going on nationally. It's a Southern issue. It's a Northern issue. There's a lot of wealth creation that was predicated on slavery. Yes.
I want to ask a question about the biblical text that 19th century apologists for slavery, or defenders of slavery, still relying on, especially the New Testament arguments they were using based on how slavery was represented or discussed in the New Testament. And so has the translations you're using today differed dramatically from how they would have understood the Greek at that time, or did it omit, or did it sort of dodge the issue of slavery at that time?
I think that I'm not a 19th century, a specialist in 19th century religion. One of the big differences is that the word that I can translate slave in the New Testament is doulos, and there's a long history in English translations of translating that servant. And that actually partly has to do with the history of the evolution of the English language. That by the time when the King James Bible was translated, there's less of a clear-cut distinction between servant and slave. I mean, that's being solidified and defined at precisely that time. So it's partly the English language is changing. So one reason that many lifelong readers of the Bible are like, oh, I didn't know they were slaves. Well, because the language has changed. And part of the problem, I think, is that there were certainly misuses of the Bible in the 19th century, and yet there are straightforward passages in the New Testament that says, slaves obey your masters, though they are your heavenly master. You've got a heavenly master in heaven who's watching you. If your master is a believer, then you need to obey your master even more. I mean, so there were some pretty straightforward texts that the pro-slavery forces could use, and of course abolitionists, both white and black abolitionists, also drew on their own really prophetic traditions of reading scripture because there's a lot in there, and so you gravitate to what is going to work for you. I'm not sure if that's answering your question or not. I don't think it's necessarily a question of Bible translation per se.
I was reading something today, and the suggestion was that Jesus is largely silent on the issue of slavery, and that doesn't seem to be what you're.
So Jesus does not say the slaves obey your masters, or don't obey. He doesn't say. He doesn't do those directives. He doesn't directly, but he does incorporate it, and that's I guess where the concept of theology. And I resisted my friend Chris Tibet for a long time on this word, but I actually do think it makes sense. What is going on in Jesus' discourse is he's making certain assumptions. So if you're going to compare eschatological punishment, which is seen as just, to a master beating the master's slaves, that implies that you think the master beating the master's slaves is just. Otherwise, eschatological punishment is unjust, right? So, I mean, I think that there's a reliance on a certain kind of slaving logic in Jesus' teaching is what I would be putting out. I don't think it's certainly not the part of early Christian tradition that most specifically speaks to slavery.
So would you say then that these defenders of slavery that relied on biblical justifications or biblical authority were on comparatively sound ground in the mid-19th century, as they understood Scripture?
I mean, I think people need to take responsibility. I don't think the Bible interprets itself, but I think we're responsible for our own interpretations. So I think that your question would in some sense assume that there was a right interpretation. And
or a reasonable one. I'm not right or wrong, but
I think people need to take responsibility for their own interpretations of anything. Constitution, Bible.
I'm with you on that.
Other questions? Yeah.
How do we reckon with a text like the in Philippians where Jesus is identified as a slave, and that he took the form of a slave? Is that in the sense that Jesus' body is also a locus of violence perpetrated, or how would you reckon with that?
Yeah, so I think that's, yes, yes. And after this, I was just talking about that text with Paul Holloway, several of us at dinner tonight. So in Philippians, there's a self-emptying that Jesus takes the form, dying on the cross. It's a violent, and so I find that a very powerful and moving text. And I do find that potentially a really transformative place, and I think that when Jesus says be slaves to one another, I take it within that same sort of kenosis, that same sort of emptying tradition. And so I do take that as potentially a very transformative, metamorphic moment. But I don't think it is for everyone at all times. And so you get into a really, this can be heard in different ways. And actually I would say that the article specifically addressing that is Sheila Briggs' article from around 1990 or so from Sewanee, Can an Enslaved God Liberate? And I would recommend that article. So there's an ambivalence there. It can be, I think, it'll be a really empowering for people who identify with that. But for those who don't, I don't want to tell them to. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, if it speaks to you, it speaks to you. But if it doesn't, I don't want to impose it on you, I guess is where I would go with that. I think I did something else I wanted to say about that. But I think that's a great place where we also understand then, there's 1 Peter. So that's a really ambiguous text. In 1 Peter, when I was actually working with the National Council, and one of the less likely things I've done, I was working with the National Council of Churches last year on sort of the translation of 1 Peter and the revision of the New Revised Standard Version, new notes. And there's a place where in 1 Peter it says, if you're, what's this precise wording now? Someone help me out. Yeah, this. If you're beaten justly, well, then just take your stripes. But if you're beaten unjustly, it's like Jesus, so you can absorb that. And it's such a problematic text in some way because it's suggesting this positive understanding of being tortured. And you also understand for someone it's a really a very empowering place. Like this is your reality. You are being beaten. So it's a way of elevating it in that same dynamic that you're talking about. Am I speaking to you? So yeah, I definitely see that in a fuller argument. And in a fuller argument, I would say even about the text I was talking about, be slaves to one another. Those are some of the links I would make, and I do feel those very deeply, but I also do feel the limitations of that. Yes, Paul.
So back to the Philippians text. When he says, he takes on the form, the morphe, shape, this physical, a lot of your work is focusing on the corporeality of slavery. So what does that mean? That he takes the form, the shape of a slave? What do you make of that?
So a couple of things. I think specifically in that case, the form of slave, even death on a cross, was being connected there to that moment of self-blowing into a moment of torture. So I think it's precisely that point. This is sort of the teleology of the beaten
So
slave.
you're anticipating that already in that expression.
Yes, I think it's the teleology of the beaten slave as the executed or crucified slave. So that's where I would specifically go in that instance.
So, I wanted to just,
This is Hannah.
thank you all again for coming, and I wanted to let you know, as Eric mentioned at the beginning, that as part of the Dialogues Cross Difference program, we are going to have a dialogue about this lecture and about what to do with many of the concepts that Dr. Glancy has raised today. And that will be on Monday, February 17th at 4:30 in the EQB house, and we'll be sending out some more information about that. But also tonight, informally after this talk, some of us will be gathering at the tavern to continue the discussion, and you